We're speaking this morning to Tuan Zameer Careem. He is an author of 2 books on the history of the Sri Lankan Malays. Thank you so much, Zameer, for speaking to us on the Light Breakfast.
And thank you so much for inviting me on the show. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you early this morning. So yeah.
Wow, you are Malay from Sri Lanka. Can you tell us a little bit about your family history and a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I was born into a Malay family. So I was raised by my parents and my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. So she has played an important role in my life. So she has played an imperative role in instilling the importance of Malay language and culture. So I was raised Malay. I speak Bahasa at home, but the language that we speak in Sri Lanka is very different to that spoken in Malaysia as well as in Indonesia. So my maternal grandmother, her name is Nei Ruhun Lai Kayat. So her grand antecedents has kind of shaped the way I am today. So that's how I am. So I speak the language and I'm very proud of my Malay heritage. And yeah, so that led me to write 2 books on the Malay history. And I'm a historian right now. I studied medicine and I'm currently doing my MPhil in history at the University of Colombo. And that's all because of my ancestors. And something which my grandmother used to tell me when I was a child is that you are a living embodiment of all your ancestors who came before you. So they continue to live on in you. So it is your duty, it is the duty that is vested upon your shoulders to kind of preserve the heritage of your forefathers. So that's one thing. And she kept telling me that you're not supposed to be speaking English at home, despite going to an English school.
Wow, really? Okay.
And you have to learn Malay. But the Malay is very different, as I mentioned earlier,
Sri
because
Lankan Malay. It's
Sri Lankan Malay.
adapted, yeah.
Bahasa Melayu Sri Lanka, because my ancestors hailed from various islands of the Indonesian archipelago. So we have like words derived from various islands. So that's how I was, that's the kind of influence I had in the childhood. And that kind of made me develop an unfeigned interest in Malay history.
So from being a doctor, you still practice, I suppose.
When I finished medical school, I wanted to get into a non-clinical sector because I wanted to be a lecturer in medical humanities. So though I do history, it's medical history at the University of Colombo. So
Right.
that's what my research is based on. But the Malay history has been a passion of mine since childhood. It's nothing to do with my career. I do write to the papers, I do write books and all that stuff. And that is mainly because of the influence of my grandmother, as I said, and then my grandfather, because he was in the police force as well as in the army. So he was also a Malay. And then he used to talk about various Malay royals who used to come to Ceylon, and then their ancestors who lived in the Kraton back in Indonesia, and all those stories kind of has enriched my life. And then that led me to develop an interest, and that is the reason why I am so passionate about the Malays. So yeah.
Now, you wrote 2 books on the
Yes.
history of the Sri Lankan Malays.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about how you researched into that book. Is it mostly from stories of your ancestors, or did you go to Indonesia where your ancestors were from to do more research?
Okay, so the very first book, both books are titled as Persaudaraan. So the second book is a revised edition and an enlarged edition of the first book. So before I started, the book was launched. The first book was launched in the year 2016, but I started writing when I was around 18. That's like in 2010, somewhere there. So yeah, if my calculations are right. So yes, so I started quite early, and my grandmother kept relating stories about, because there was this regiment called the Ceylon Rifle Regiment. So it was established by the British, and that's one of the reasons why the Malays were brought from Indonesian archipelago as well as from Malaya, and they were recruited as soldiers and mercenaries. So all my ancestors, 9 generations of my family before me, served in the armed forces, that is the Ceylon Rifle Regiment, and then in the police force. So I haven't joined the police,
I
unfortunately.
was just about to ask you that.
So, yeah.
9 generations.
Yes,
Wow.
9 generations on my mother's side of the family. And my maternal grandfather, his name is Dean Kayat, Radin Dean Kayat, and his family, the progenitor of the Kayat family in Ceylon, hailed from Banda. So when I was a little child, so my grandfather used to tell me that his ancestor, an Orang Kaya in Banda, a chieftain, was exiled by the Dutch VOC, and because they discovered nutmeg on the island, and then they were exiled from Makassar and Lower Sunda Islands to Batavia, and then from Batavia, the present-day Jakarta, to Sri Lanka. So they were held captive in these fortresses. And this is how I developed the interest. And then I started going to the National Archives when I was pretty, like around 4, 5, like not around 4, 5. I started going to the museum when I was around 5 years old. I started going to the archives when I was around 12, 13, because my school was, I went to Royal College Colombo, which is quite close to the National Archives of our country. And the stories of my grandparents, and then also to verify the facts, because despite my grandmother coming from an illustrious family, which has deep roots, like in terms of Malay heritage and stuff, because her ancestors, we have one, Pangeran Chintaraden Susuma of Mataram, of Java. So that's one of my ancestors. And then my grandmother's mother, she comes from a family called the Jaya clan. So the progenitor of the Jaya clan in Sri Lanka, called Raden Tirtopurma Jaya, came from Goa, which is in Sulawesi, Indonesia. So I kept listening to these stories, and that kind of inspired me to take on writing as well as to do the research. So I spent many years researching, and I was mentored by this person called Deshamani Devendra, and it wasn't an easy process. It took some time because I had to verify the facts. Then in terms of the whole culture, the tradition, the customs, rites and rituals, all those stories were related to my grandmother. The book doesn't just contain stories on history. So
Yeah.
Persaudaraan carries each and every element that makes the Malay identity. So in terms of the cuisine, the makanan Melayu, from daging chuka, daging goreng to ikan, all those things which my grandmother used to cook. So all those recipes and various other things. And about clothes, because my Nene is like, I call my grandmother as Nene. So Nene used to talk about, like the baju kurung, baju Melayu, the kabaya and the kalung and the accessories, the tusuk konde and kumbang goreng, the makanan and all those things. So that kind of led me to write and then also to find the roots. So yeah.
After that whole experience, though, do you feel more connected to your roots?
Oh yes, I did get in touch with few Indonesians, and I did want to go to Indonesia. Unfortunately, I couldn't because I was based abroad. That is where I pursued my higher studies abroad. So I was not in Sri Lanka. So it was in 2017 after the launch of my second book. So my mother was like, all I got to hear stories, and she wanted to go to Indonesia and see her ancestral land. So some of the ancestors were from Banda, some from Java, from Makassar, Gorontalo, Limboto. So they wanted to go to these places,
Yeah.
and they did. And unfortunately, I couldn't. And then my mom went to Malaysia as well. Unfortunately, I have not set foot on Malaysian soil, nor have I been to Indonesia, but I would love to, but inshallah in the future. So yeah.
Actually, I'm just trying to figure out. Can you tell the difference between Indonesian Malays in Sri Lanka, Indonesian Malays, and those that came from Malaya back then? Are there differences in how the Malay language is spoken?
Okay, so what happened is that initially the Dutch brought people from Indonesian archipelago. So most of them were soldiers who were recruited by the Dutch VOC, and the rest were royals who were exiled from various islands of Indonesia. Royal, their entourages of soldiers, their courtiers, their ministers, members of the royal family, servants, slaves were brought to Ceylon. So most of them came from Indonesia, and they were referred to by the Dutch as Australingan, meaning Easterners. Okay, so this was up until the time of 1796. So when the British conquered the maritime provinces of Ceylon and took control over the colony, they couldn't identify them by their ethnicities. Like there was Orang Java, Orang, from various plots, Sunda,
Yeah.
Banda, and all those things. So the British found it very difficult, and they didn't want to use Australingan instead. So they chose the word Malay to identify anyone who hailed from Indonesian archipelago, which was then called Dutch East Indies, as well as from Malaya. So the proportion of Malays in Sri Lanka whose ancestors hailed from Malaya is a very small number. So most of our ancestors came from Indonesia and from various islands, like various other islands of the the Malayan Peninsula, and then from some parts of Labuan and those areas. But we did have ties with the Malaysians like since time immemorial. In fact, as way back as 12th century, there was a king called Chandrabanu Sri Dharmaraja who came from a kingdom called Tambralinga. So Tambralinga was under the rule of the Sri Vijayan Empire. So I don't want to bore you with all this. Anyways. So yeah,
Interesting.
so this Chandrabanu, the king, he was identified as Javaka. So that's how he's been identified in the Sri Lankan chronicles. So he came all the way from this place called Taramballinga and from Nikon Sri Thammarat, which is next to Kedah in Malaysia.
All right, okay.
Okay, so he came to Ceylon in 13th century, in 1247, waged war against the Sri Lankan kings, conquered the northern part of the island, and then he ruled over the territory. And then following his death, his son, Chavakamindan, became the next successive ruler. And then he ruled over the territory as well. And he built Buddhist temples because back then Malaya and the rest of the Sri Vijayan Empire, they professed Buddhism. So when he came to Ceylon, the reason why he came to Ceylon is because he wanted to capture the tooth relic, because we have Lord Buddha's tooth in Sri Lanka. So
Oh.
the reason why Chandrabanu came to Ceylon is to ostensibly seize the tooth relic and get it back to the kingdom in Tambralinga. So he had in fact built a temple over there so that he could enshrine it. But he came to Ceylon, he waged numerous battles, and all his efforts were futile. And then he couldn't get hold of the tooth relic. Instead, he chose the northern part of the island, conquered it, and ruled it for a long time. And he built the famous Kandarode Buddhist temple, which looks very similar to the Borobudur temples that you find in
Right.
so yeah, so we have the whole Buddhist heritage. And then in the 8th century AD, you had seafarers, Orang Laut, Orang Bajau
Yep,
from
yep.
various Indonesian thalassocracies who came to Ceylon, settled, and we have various villages in the littoral villages in the maritime provinces of the island that kind of you could trace the Malay origin in terms of the etymology. So we have a town called Hambantota. You still find the Malay fisherfolk there. So Hambantota gets its name from Sampan Tot. So Sampan is a boat or a skiff that is used for the transportation of provisions, and Tot is derived from Sanskrit, which means an anchorage. So likewise, any place that was ruled over by the Javanese got this Ja prefix. So for example, in Sri Lanka, you have many place names like Ja Kotua, which means Javanese fortress,
Right.
have Ja Ella, which means the Javanese, the stream or some sort of a canal. Likewise, in the Northern Kingdom, one of the major cities is called Jaffna. Jaffna comes from Java Pattinam, which means the Javanese who settled, the settlement of the Javanese, and that's what it means. And that is because Chandrabanu conquered the territory. And most of the villages in Jaffna, in the northern peninsula of the island, have Javanese origin in terms of the place names. And you have Java Tupu, you have Java Kacheri, which means the fortress of the Javanese, Java Kodua. You have numerous places. In
So
the
if I
country.
walk around Sri Lanka and I'm like anything that has a JA, I'm like, ha!
Yes,
Malay
everything's got a J.
historical. Okay, right.
And
Wow. So
so
it's
we-
very intertwined, the Malay history with the Sri Lankan history.
very intertwined. In fact, most of the Sri Lankan kings back then, because they were Buddhist, they did marry princesses who were from Sumatra and various islands of the Indonesian archipelago. So we did have ties. In fact, one of the famous kings of Sri Lanka called Parakramabahu, his mother, Ratnavali, in fact, hailed from Indonesia. So we have most of the kings who have Indonesian and Malay lineage. And the Sri Lankans have always been very proud of their Indonesian roots. It has not been forgotten, and that the Indonesian element is still evident in terms of the culture and in terms of the food. So yeah, so the whole, sambol and all those various other stuff. So if you go to a Sinhalese home, it's always the sambol and the laksa and, all those food items are pretty popular.
That's
I talk so
brilliant.
much about food despite being skinny and scrawny.
What's your day-to-day meal, go-to meal though, in your household?
All types of nasi goreng, nasi lemak, nasi kabuli, nasi santang. Santang nasi is with coconut milk. And then all kinds of meat varieties. Unfortunately, now I'm a vegetarian.
Okay.
After having, let me not dwell on that. But anyways, so all the whole daging items, you have the daging goreng, the satay, and the chuka, and various other things. And then also the desserts, the tantalizing delicacies like sirkaya, and dodol and various other things like kumbang.
Dodol. Do you guys eat durian there?
Yes, we do have durian
Oh, God.
and rambutan and all those things, which are believed to have been introduced by the Malays.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the sarong and the kite flying in Sri Lanka is believed to have been introduced by the Malays. Not just the Malays in this country. The reason why the general populace of this nation love the Malays is because we didn't just serve the Dutch and the British. We also served the Sri Lankan kings. And it's something which not many people talk about, because the Sri Lankan kings, even the last Sinhalese king of this country, and all the way up until the last king who ruled was in fact a Telugu king from India. So his name is Sri Vikramaraja Singha. So he had 32 companies of Malay soldiers, and each company had 22 companies with 32 soldiers each. So in fact, one of his main military chiefs was called Kareng Sangkilan. And he came from Makassar Island, and his father, Batara Goa Amas Madina II, was exiled from Goa, Sulawesi, and he took refuge in the island. So we have so many Malays who have contributed so much because the soldiers were brought to work for the British and the Dutch. Then you also had these exiled, the royals who came to Ceylon.
Yeah.
And they were held captive in the very fortresses which the Malays built. So when you go around Sri Lanka and see the Dutch forts in Galle, in Colombo, in various parts of the island, these forts were not built by the Dutch or the Sri Lankans. these forts were built by the Malays, by the Indian laborers, and by the Kafirs, though it's a derogatory term to identify those of African descent. It's those people who built these structures. And in these very structures which the Malays built, the Malay exiles were held captive. And there was a place in Colombo called Kampong Pangeran. So that's where most of my mom's side of the family hailed from. So they were held captive in this area called Kampong Pangeran. So it's like you could walk about, but there's a wall and you can't escape. So you're basically held captive there for years. So they gave birth to children, they got married, everything happened inside this village. They had their own cemetery and the Pisam Makam. So it's the royal mausoleum where all the royals, following their death, they were buried there. Some of them were later exhumed, their bodies were exhumed and sent back to Java. So these are some of the stories concerning the Malays who settled in this country. So yeah.
Nice. Okay, you said the Sri Lankan Malays were brought in mostly as soldiers and some were royal exiles, but what is the main form of economy for the Sri Lankan Malays in this day and age?
Okay, in this day and age, it depends on where do the Malays hail from. So the Malays who live in Colombo are primarily into banking and all sorts of walks of life. So whether it be doctors, engineers, lawyers, and all that. But in this day and age, most of the youngsters prefer choosing banking and the commercial sector. And into media, for example, we have a lot of journalists and as well as writers who are from the Malay community. But when you go to places such as Kirinda, which is a very small Malay hamlet down south of Sri Lanka, they're all fisher folk. So even to this day, ever since they came to this island, since 8th century AD, they've been practicing fishing. So they're still fisher folk and they speak a dialect which is very different to what we speak because their Malay is very Javanese, not really Malay. Okay. And the British used the word Malay to identify us because of the fact that we hailed from that part of the world and not necessarily because of the fact that we're ethnic Malays. Yes. There are a few Malays who are ethnic Malays. Like, for example, my maternal grandmother is a Peranakan China. So she's of mixed Malay and Chinese origin. So her ancestor, Captain Babapur Salelai, was from a Pechinan village in Mataram in Java. And so that's the reason why her family has various, like the prefixes are different. Because, for example, I have Tuan, and so before my name, so the rest of the family has like Mas or Mas Tuan or Tunku or Raden. But the Pechinan, the Peranakan side of the family of mine, they have other prefixes like Baba for men and Nyonya for women. So that's still there. And there are a few families of Peranakan heritage in this country. So yeah.
My God.
That's mind blown. Yeah, because we thought Peranakan's only in the Malay Peninsula, the Peranakan culture and all that. But what are some of the cultures and traditions that have been passed down from generations of Sri Lankan Malays that you still practice till today?
Okay, so some of the traditions in terms of the wedding, the carving, and because just like how it happens in the Yogyakarta and various other kingdoms, our weddings are like pretty long. So we have like 7-day wedding. Back then they used to have 30 days wedding. Yeah. Just like how it used to happen in the kratons. So likewise, you have the Tujuh Bulanan, that is when the lady is 7 months pregnant. You have a specific ritual that's been performed. So it also comes from Indonesia. And Gigi Datang Hari is like the day where you have the first tooth that erupts for the child. So you have a specific ritual for that. And Rambut Chukur, in the sense like we don't name the child just after the child is born because we still have those Hindu and Buddhist elements in our culture. So we have not been Islamicized so much yet. So what we do is after 40 days after the child's birth, that's when the child gets the proper name. So before that, you keep telling that, the child's name is Bintan Kumban, Malati something. And then only on the 40th day, you give the proper name to the child. And you do the tonsuring of the hair of the head, and then you remove the hair, and then you do lots of rituals. Too complicated, too numerous to enumerate right now. So yeah, and then you have so many other things. And we also have the Tarik Tambang and Pukulan China and Silat and various other sports that our ancestors brought from Indonesia. And most of those are still being practiced. And the Blakal Hari, the Hari Raya Puasa, Hari Raya Haji, and all those festivities celebrated in full splendor. And our rituals are very different to that of the rest of the Muslim population in this country. And also the naming ceremony of ours, like luckily, not luckily, but my father kind of chose Arabic sounding names, but the rest of the family, most of them have like Sanskrit names, like Like we still have those old names which we get from those old books that have been passed down for generation to generation.
But
So we still,
generally names, I mean, like here in Malaysia, we have Ahmad, and you know what I mean, the regular simple names. But do you guys have that there as well?
we do have, it's pretty common these days. Like if you take like the previous generations, they were all like Mintari and Bintan and Kumban and Melati and
No
like
Siti, no Halizas.
you have the city, not that prevalent, and you have all these very typical Javanese name and Kumari and
Mm-hmm.
Shila Devi and those type of names. A lot of Devis in the names in order to attribute them to the goddesses named after various Hindu goddesses and stuff. So this was pretty common up until my grandmother's generation, and then they started, and even now, even those Tuan, Mas, Raden, Tunku Raden, and all those prefixes are also going into abeyance because not many people would want to use it because people get, and then our surnames like Singha Vijaya, Singha Wangsa, Lapen, Kupen, Lantra, all those names are all Sanskrit based or derived from various other languages. And so now they're changing them into Arabic sounding surnames. So they're dropping their Malay surnames because no one wants to be identified as Amangkurat or a Pakabuana in this day and age. Because when you go to school and say, I'm like Tuan, Sri Vijaya, Pakabuana, it's going to sound hideous. So, and people are going to laugh at you. And that's one of the reasons why they drop. And then during the British period, most of them adopted English sounding names, very westernized names like Edward, John, whatever. And we in fact had a Methodist priest called Kamal Atun Chunchi who went on to serve as a Methodist priest in England. And so we have Malays who have stamped their identities in various walks of life and in all religions. So yeah.
But are there any cultures and tradition that has been adapted into the Sri Lankan Malay culture?
Over the years, yes. And it depends again from where you come from. So if you come from a place where you're surrounded with the people who are from the Tamil or the Sinhalese communities, you tend to adopt their culture because cultural assimilation is inevitable.
Yeah.
And it has happened in this country over the course of time. So you do have people who have adopted the Sinhalese culture and the Tamil culture. Then you also have people who lived in Colombo who kind of are still staunchly Anglophile. So we still have portraits of the Queen in our homes, and we're very proud of the royal family and all that stuff. So that's because of the thought that's been passed down from generation to generation, because we're very proud of the Victorian medals which our forefathers had received. And so, yeah, every time there's something related to the British royal family, you'll find all the Malays sitting in front of the TV and watching it for like hours. So it's still there, but it depends from which part of the family you come from. So,
By the way, is that a picture of the Queen behind you?
yes.
I was thinking, is that your grandma? I wonder. But like...
No, it is not my grandma. She is as regal as the Queen, but no, we have not like a proper portrait, and we are hoping to hang it. She's 88 years old. She's live and kicking. I should not be
Wow.
saying, but yeah. But she still relates wonderful stories about the Malays, and she's staunchly Anglophile, a strong monarchist. So yes. And talking about monarchy, in fact, we have had strong ties with the Malaysian royal houses. In fact, Tunku Abdul Rahman, when he visited Ceylon in 1967, he was quite impressed with what he saw. And likewise, there was this king called Sultan Sir Abu Bakr of Johor. And he visited the island in 1865 en route to his European tour. He stopped by, he was very happy to meet the Malays in this country. So he told them that you should be very loyal to the British and uphold their values and fight for them and defend the country and fight for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of British Ceylon. So yeah, after Sultan Abu Bakr, it was his son, Sir Ibrahim, the Sultan of Johor, who became the first patron of the Ceylon Malay Association in the year 1922. So Sultan Ibrahim of Johor served as a patron until his death. And then the members of his family, Sultan Iskandar, Sultan Ibrahim again, Sultan is even the current crown prince. He visited the island a couple of years back. And we have maintained ties with the Johor royal family back then, but now the ties aren't as strong as it used to be, as well as with the Kedah royal house. And so yeah, these are some of the stories about the royal houses. But with Brunei and the rest of the Indonesian royal houses, we haven't had ties. And so Johor family has in fact helped for the upliftment of the Malay community in this country. So yeah.
Just for fun, Tuan Zameer, can you tell us Malaysians in your Sri Lankan Malay, what can we look forward to when we visit Sri Lanka?
I doubt whether people could understand it.
Come on, you just
Try.
yeah.
Try us.
Okay, so Sri Lanka na datang ko rompan na banyak pada belajar ambil na boleh. In this, I'm trying to use English. So banyak pada in the sense, tumpat pada na PIA Sri Lanka pe history pe atas, itam pada pe tubiat pada pe atas, turungan pada pe atas, banyak belajar ambil na boleh. Buku pada tulis pada ada banyak. So ini pada na belajar kulu rompan na Melayu orang pada pe इतिहास पढ़ पे atas, Melayu orang pada pe tubiat pada pe atas, jam pada pe dudukan pada pe atas rompan belajar ambil boleh tambah negeri na datang kulu. Itu cara Melayu makanan pada rompan makanan boleh, Melayu makanan pada banyak tempat pada kada, kelumbu kapis duduk, banyak tempat pada rompan pi lantran, rompan banyak bahasa saya bukan makanan nale rompan makan kapis. Atau bayar time itu tambah negeri ka spend karena boleh datang kulu Malaysia dari Indonesia dari tambah negeri na datang kulu. So yeah.
I picked out some words.
Yes, I picked up makanan, buku, belajar. Yeah, but
Yeah.
other than that, it sounds foreign. Yeah.
Yeah, it does sound foreign. And yeah,
And this is Sri Lankan Malay.
this is Sri Lankan Malay. So yeah, like if you happen to talk to my grandmother, you'll probably understand her Malay much better than mine. And so I do remember just a few pantungs and those type of stuff, which were, and a few songs and stuff. But besides those, yeah, I don't want to sing right now. But anyway,
JD is already scratching his.
Yeah, I'm like, oh yes. But you know what? In many cases, like here in Malaysia itself, if you go to different parts of Malaysia, let's say you go to the East Coast, there's some Malay that even
dialects.
we don't understand, because it's just exactly it's a dialect. But sometimes our Malay has been so pop cultured in a way that sometimes it has changed. So I understand completely why when the Malay language in Sri Lanka has changed as well, especially generationally, right?
yeah, with the course of time. And one more important thing is that the very first Malay newspaper in Java script was not printed in Malaysia or in Indonesia. It was printed in Sri Lanka. And it was in the year 1869. It was Baba Unus Saldin who printed the very first Malay newspaper in Java script. And it was called Alamat Lankapuri, meaning news from Sri Lanka. And this was a long time ago. This was in 1869, June. That's when he commenced his publication. He was an editor, a publisher, and a lithographer. And he continued it up until 1870. And then he resumed publication in 1870s again. And then again in 1895, there was another newspaper called Wajah Ceylon, meaning light of Ceylon, because that's the former name of Sri Lanka, Ceylon. So yeah, so he was the very first man in the world to publish a newspaper in the Java script. And it was in fact a Sri Lankan Ceylonese Malay. So our grandparents used to write in the JavaScript. Unfortunately, we haven't learned it. And I can't write in the JavaScript. And so yeah, so these are some of the stuff. And then the Malays have also left a strong imprint on the history of the island, because there was a minister called Dr. T.B. Jaya, Tuan Jaya, who became the very first minister of social services and labor, the first Malay to be exalted to such a position. And then he later on went to serve as Sri Lanka's High Commissioner for Pakistan. And the very first non-Christian to be appointed to the Supreme Court bench of Sri Lanka, of Ceylon back then, was a Malay named Mas Tajun Akbar, who was appointed in 1929. And it was he who introduced the Waqt ordinance, the marriage and the divorce ordinance in this country. And some of the Malays served as senators, like you had Dr. M.P. Draman and Dr. Zahir Lai, and he was called Baba Zahir Lai from my grandmother's clan. And then you also had various other people like M.K. Saldin and M.D. Kishalan. They were legislative council members and senators, and they had strong ties with Sukarno, Suharto, and Tunku Abdul Rahman, and all those people back then. In fact, when Indonesia was to gain independence, there was a man called Dr. M.P. Rahman who closed the Ceylon's ports for the Dutch ships, and he was supporting Merdeka. And so yeah, the Ceylonese have also fought alongside the Indonesians for them to gain independence. And even during the Indonesian Independence Day celebration, Merdeka, the Ceylonese were invited. Likewise, Tunku Abdul Rahman also maintained strong ties with Dr. M.P. Rahman as well as with Baba Zahir Lai. So yeah, these are like some of the stories about the Malays who have left, stamped their identity in this country. So yeah.
Fascinating. Now, as a younger generation Sri Lankan Malay, why do you think it is important for the future generations of Sri Lankan Malay to know their roots and to know their history?
I keep telling this quite often to all my friends as well as to relatives, that if you do not know where you come from, you'll never appreciate where you're going. So it is very important for all of us as youngsters to uphold the values of our ancestors, maintain their traditions, values, ethos, customs, culture, traditions, everything, and to pass it on to the next generation. And cultural awareness is something which is a serious issue in this country, because cultural assimilation is in a way a threat. Likewise, mixed marriages and marrying outside of the community has led to, but I'm not against it, I'm totally fine. But yeah, so marrying outside of the community has in a way led to the whole culture being destroyed and stuff. It depends on whom you get married to. If the person is willing to incorporate elements of the Malay culture and instill these values to their children, it's great. But most of the time, it's usually the other way around. So the children adopt the fathers or the mother's side who are not Malays, and this kind of leads to other issues. And then the population has declined over the past couple of decades, because since 1980 the population has decreased by 20%, and that is because most of the Malays are migrating abroad, and that commenced in 1956. So in 1956 the Ceylonese government passed the Sinhala Only Act, and the Malays who studied in English couldn't pursue their education, nor could they find jobs, because of the fact that Sinhala was made the national language of the country. And this led to many Malays migrating and moving to foreign lands in search of employment and looking for greener pastures. And migration, and then now the current issue is fertility problems, because a lot of people in this country, most of the Malays, have fertility issues, and most of my uncles and aunts do not have children. That is another problem. Migration and language attrition. So Sri Lankan Malay is an endemic language of this country. So it is our duty to talk the language at home. And I know that I may not be the best authority to speak on this subject, but still, I prefer that if the youngsters could talk to their relatives, especially listen to your ancestors. If your nene, your kake, your moyang kake, your sanak, when they relate stories, please, lend your ear. It's not going to cost you anything. So listen to their stories, learn something. It's always nice to spend time with your elders, because you'll miss it later on. So when they're around, cherish those moments and cherish those memories. You learn a lot, because they're fountains of wisdom. You don't need to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge in order for you to learn something from your ancestors. They could have, they might not be educated, but you could learn a lot from the way you lead your life to what you have to do, in order to live a very simple and a fruitful life. And living a very happy life is the key to success. So yeah, so live happily, and and respect the elders around you, and try to do something to preserve the culture of this community, which is unfortunately on the brink of extinction. So yeah.
I like it that you're wearing a batik. I just noticed that.
Oh yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Zameer, for speaking to us.